So, what I want to do today is continue on and sort of finish up our section, the second section of the course, right? Talking about personality theory, individual differences. And so today we're really going to focus on these contemporary personality approaches. The trait approach, and we'll talk about some work on temperament and some work on sort of what's called the Big Five, and introduce you to that concept if you haven't already. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the social cognitive approach, particularly work on delayed gratification and attributional style optimism that has some kind of interesting implications for mental health. So, bunch of stuff I want to get through, so let me just forge ahead here. So you've seen this, exam next Thursday, study guide will be up later today. Again, it only covers the material through today, and then next time we're going to introduce some stuff for the next time because of this funny conference thing that we have going on Thursday. So that's the basic gist on that. Any questions about the exam? Go to there'll be reviews sessions in in those discussion sections. So hopefully you learned a little bit from that first exam. Next exam will be very similar. Questions will be similar. So take advantage of all those opportunities, right? So take advantage of the review sessions and everything else. If you haven't looked at your exam, go look at your exam. Any questions? Good. So, remember last time we talked about this, showed this slide at the end last time, that there's this real difference between these classic views of personality, which tend to be these big theories about, kind of almost philosophical positions on human nature. They tended to come out of clinical psychology, not really based on scientific data, and they tend to be these broad theories that talk about historical development of personality. The contemporary view is really much more data-oriented, much more, and some of it's very statistical. You'll see, I'll try to explain in sort of non-statistical terms how some of this stuff goes. Again, much more focused and specific. Tend to be focused on sort of one really particular aspect of personality. So not a comprehensive theory of personality, but kind of a more specific, focused version. The kind of classic view of, one of the really great examples of this contemporary view of personality is really what's generally referred to as the trait approach. And the trait approach, in some ways, is a really commonsensical, intuitive way to approach personality. And in fact, it sort of begins with the idea that there are thousands of words in the English language and really in every other language to describe personality characteristics of people. So again, personality being these enduring characteristics of people that differentiate them from others but seem to be sort of consistent over time. So we have thousands of words like that. We talk about people as being outgoing or assertive or shy, reserved, aggressive, all sorts of, we have thousands of these words, and the idea that really sort of percolated up among a lot of people is this must mean something, right? These words, the language must track some real things going on in people, right? So people wouldn't have all these words for personality if it didn't sort of map onto some reality. And what they are is kind of like traits of people, right? And there's a difference. I want to distinguish this idea between traits, types, and states, which are different kinds of terms that are used in the personality literature. So first of all, there's a difference between traits and states. So when we're talking about a state of that somebody's in, you could be in an outgoing mood, right? Which is different from being an outgoing person, right? So when we're talking about traits, again, we're talking about this fundamental personality notion that it's an enduring over time and situation, as opposed to state, which are just moods or temporary conditions here. And now, many of the same words are used, right, to describe both traits and states. So you could be in an outgoing mood, or you could be an outgoing person. You could be, a depressed or a depressive sort of person, right? So but when we're talking about traits, we're talking about this idea of enduring sort of characteristics. In terms of traits versus types, right? So traits are specific. The way to think about them is that they're dimensions, in a sense, that people differ on. They're not types of people so much. Right, so when trait researchers want to talk about using the term trait, they're talking about like a dimension, like outgoing or introverted to extroverted, where people vary along some dimension in a continuous way. Right, they're not really types of people so much. The idea of a type of person is, so traits in a sense are these sort of specific things. They talk about one aspect of your personality, not all of your personality, right? So it's an aspect or a dimension on which people differ, not kind of a kind of person, where you might be outgoing, right? So you're high in that dimension, but that doesn't mean there are all sorts of other aspects of your personality. You can be outgoing and assertive, or outgoing and aggressive, or not aggressive, outgoing and a happy person versus sort of more melancholy or sad person, right? So those traits are these very specific dimensions, and they're different from types. Now, types, these kinds of people, that sort of work has been done historically in psychology. It's kind of interesting to look at that. That was really the first kind of way that people approach the idea of personality, that there's sort of types of people, like that you can put people into little bins. The Greeks were really the first to talk about that, or at least that we know of, and it's well documented. So there was this general theory that developed, among physicians and others. I think Galen was one of the ones that talked about this. But the idea that the Greeks had is there were these 4 different humors, or 4 different kind of liquids in the body, and there were different people. If you had an excess of one kind, right, it made you one kind of person. If you had an excess of another kind, it made you a different person, right? So there were these ideas. There were blood, yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile. And people who had sort of an excess of blood in their system, they tended to be happy, optimistic people. People who had too much yellow bile were this sort of choleric personality, aggressive and ambitious. If you were you were, again, with their term phlegmatic, that we still use sometimes, being sluggish or cowardly, kind of reserved. And black bile being this kind of introspective, kind of, again, melancholy, kind of sad, sentimental person. So they had these ideas, and that was kind of captured. You were one of those 4 kinds of people, right? Again, they weren't really traits in that way. They were types of people. Just like his name was William Sheldon in the 1940s developed this sort of interesting typology of people. He said that there was this connection. It's a very intuitive idea. There's this connection between people's physical state, right, their physical presence, their physical characteristics, and their psychological ones, right? So he thought that there were 3 kinds of people. There were what he called endomorphs, mesomorphs, or ectomorphs, and they were characterized by a certain body type. So the endomorph was kind of the plump person. They tended to be tolerant, socially relaxed, kind of the happy, chubby person, right? So there's this kind of real sort of stereotyped aspect of this. You're this kind of big, you have big bones, your big body, and you tend to be this sort of endomorphic, pretty kind of easygoing person. A mesomorph was the kind of muscular, the one in the middle, adventurous, assertive, competitive. So they were kind of the aggressive, sort of classic male, figure. And ectomorph, this sort of thin person, tended to be introverted, anxious, artistic. Right? There wasn't much data to support this. You can see it sort of fits everybody's stereotypes. Oh yeah, there's that the skinny guy even looks like he's going to be shy and kind of reserved. And chubby, oh yeah, he's going to be happy, right? But there's not much data to that. But that's that idea of types. But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about dimensions, these traits that people have. Now, sometimes some of these dimensions are pretty powerful, lots of parts of your life, right? But again, the idea is to keep in mind is that there are these dimensions on which people differ. Questions about that? So let me talk about one of the sort of really interesting, and it's a trait, right? But it's kind of a broad, seems to have broad implications for human personality based on a lot of research. And that is this notion of temperament, right? So anybody, again, I asked this and I know the answer. Anybody have kids here? Couple people? No, nobody, no, you've been around little kids, right? Sometimes you can tell when I had my kids, when they come out, right, they're different. And there's things that happen, and some babies are really energetic and anxious and seem to cry a lot and do these things, and some babies are just kind of laid back. So my first child was much more, my first and third kids actually were much more kind of, you could tell some things seemed to bother them a lot, right? And the middle one was much more laid back and it seemed to be less responsive to stimuli. Now, lots of parents have noticed this thing, and in fact, there was been a lot of research now, a lot of it done by a guy named Jerome Kagan, that demonstrates that this is really a central part of human personality, right? So it's a characteristic behavioral emotional style that's evident from a young age and seems to be genetically based, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the idea is that it's even the idea is it's this sort of again genetically based kind of notion that it's an individual's emotional nature, including susceptibility to emotional stimulation, prevailing mood, fluctuation, intensity of mood, right? And in fact, it's so biological you can kind of see it in other animals, right? So I have these pictures up here. Some dogs are kind of just aggressive and they get bothered a lot by things, and some dogs are really mellow and happy, and you see the same sort of things in babies, right? And you can notice that this seems to be a really characteristic trait that babies can be sorted on, and has lots of implications for their future behavior. So what Jerome Kagan, again, a Harvard developmental psychologist, has been studying this for years, and he has found that there's basically these two you can kind of lay people out on this dimension of inhibited to uninhibited temperament. So again, the inhibited temperament tends to be shy, anxious, fearful in novel situations. Uninhibited is the more outgoing, easygoing, calm. They're comfortable with novel stimuli. And he studied these all the way from babies, and you can recognize this even in children at a very young age in a very simple way. Let me show you just a little video of him and with some of these babies. I had to do it on YouTube here. Let's see if so let me see if we can get this going. Hopefully this is going to do. Oops. Did I hit the wrong button? Dang.
Are you an extrovert?
No.
Temperament is one interest of childhood observer Jerome Kagan.
Absolutely no motor tension at all. The fact that we're finding differences among infants and children will come as no surprise to anybody. Remember the old rhyme, Monday's child is fair-faced, Wednesday's child is full of wool. What we are discovering, which is relatively new, is that there is a large set of temperamental categories. We don't know how many scientists will eventually discover. We happen to be focusing on two of them. What is most surprising and very gratifying to all of us is that we're able to predict those two types of children from a very simple behavior when that child is 4 months old.
Kagan says certain reactions in 4-month-olds foreshadow future shyness or sociability.
So the vocalization reflects that the child is becoming increasingly excited by them.
Kagan is on the average, not likely to be very outgoing or very shy. But Jordan's reaction to the same stimulus is very different.
See the motor activity of the arms and the legs. So you'll notice as Jordan looks at the movies, you see how his legs begin to thrash and flex and his arms begin to move because he's becoming excited to the visual stimulation.
These responses indicate just the opposite of what one might expect. But Kagan and colleagues have found a remarkable consistency.
And he's passed his thresholds.
A child like Jordan, who reacts in 4 months with extreme distress, represents the kind of child who later may become very quiet.
It's that pattern of motor tension, the thrashing of the arms and legs, and then the irritability. It's that pattern that tends to be characteristic of a temperament that later on is a little bit biased to become a shy, timid, restrained child when that child is 1 or 2 years of age. Some parents who are very shy, fearful children often misinterpret that behavior and assume it's because they did something wrong. They went on a vacation at the wrong time, they punished when they should not have punished. When, in fact, this child was born with that neurochemistry that made it likely to behave in this way.
In contrast, a child like Katrina, who's quiet in the extreme, is exhibiting behavior that may mean she'll be more outgoing later.
Here's a little bit of arm movement. Then you want to notice the lack of tension in her legs, in her arms. You see how relaxed that hand is? That's a very nice contrast. Very nice contrast. When you see Katrina at 14 months, if she's like the other 300 infants we've seen, then you're going to see a sociable, emotionally spontaneous, non-fearful, outgoing 1-year-old. Right? Now we'll see if I'm right. We're going to see you at 14 months. We're going to see if my prediction is correct. Katrina, don't make a liar out of me, huh? Don't make a liar out of me. My colleague Nathan Fox has related different brain patterns to different temperaments. Electrodes in the cap measure the child's brain activity, recorded as distinctive patterns. As in our studies, the child is then exposed to some everyday stimulus. The printouts measure the electrical activity of the left and right sides of the brain. Amazingly, very shy infants show greater activity in one hemisphere. Very outgoing infants show greater activity in the other hemisphere. In average children, both sides of the brain show the same balanced pattern of electrical activity, which I think is based on underlying chemistry and physiology. Now, even though that chemistry is inherited, our fate is not in our genes. Biology is not our destiny.
Kagan believes a child's future is not shaped by temperament alone, but rather by how parents and others respond to the child's genetic inheritance.
There is a wonderful and permanent interaction between what is the biology of the child and that child's environment. There's no need for parents or teachers to be fatalistic about temperamental categories.
So, again, it's really, really interesting, and it's been well documented in research as kind of basic characteristic that a lot of people have noticed. And again, it's a little counterintuitive when you go through it. So first of all, there's good evidence that it seems to be genetic, as Kagan, and that video is a little bit old, but as Kagan suggests, right, there seems to be some evidence that there's a physiological basis for this. So this is just the correlation between monozygotic twins versus dizygotic twins. Not a perfect measure of genetic inheritance, but a decent one. And again, if you give the twins these different kinds of tests, how long they'll look at a stranger, whether they'll approach a stranger, nearness to a stranger, these are things you do a little bit later on, kind of stranger anxiety. You can see there's a really high correlation. So if one monozygotic twin has a lot of stranger anxiety, the other one tends to also, then dizygotic twins are really not very related at all, right? Or not nearly as related. So it seems to be something genetic. Same sort of thing here. If you have people rate the emotionality of babies, other people, then again, monozygotic twins, the correlation between the monozygotic twins is much higher than between dizygotic twins. So it suggests that this is this basic sort of genetic or it's genetically transmitted with the underlying substrate. And again, it seems to be this kind of interesting, a little bit counterintuitive notion that babies who are low in temperament tend to respond, or babies who have this sort of, inhibited temperament, right, tend to respond more vigorously to stimuli. Now and babies that are uninhibited tend to, again, not show much. They're not as reactive. They just don't respond. Again, this is kind of the measurements from parts of the brain. In this case, and this is really the more recent work, it focuses on the amygdala, which the amygdala is the part of the brain that really seems to be involved in fear and anger sort of responses. And again, if you measure electrical activity in babies, that ones that are sort of have were labeled as inhibited or uninhibited based on this 4-month test will show just this kind of pattern where in novel stimuli, again, inhibited babies show a much more vigorous response. It's even there to familiar things, but it's particularly to novel stimuli, right? So the idea is that some babies just have this tendency to be really reactive to things, right? And then if you're really reactive to things make you kind of nervous and anxious, then you want to pull away. You want to kind of get away from people to settle yourself down. You develop this sort of introverted style where you're not getting, other people sort of stimulate you too much. And so you sort of self-regulate by moving away and more comfortable. Extroverted people, other things don't bother them as much. Other people don't bother them as much. They're not as anxious, and so they're more open in social situations, or less self-conscious. All those kinds of things. So it seems to be this basic, underlying biological trait. But but Kagan makes a really good point about it, and one of the points, because we've been talking a lot about genetic influence, right? Nothing's ever 100% genetic or 100% environmental. And it's this really interactive process. And I can speak to this very clearly, at least in my experience, right? So my first child was like this, really colicky, super, was always just really freaked out about things. And my wife and I responded to that by freaking out too, right? It's like, baby's upset, we're upset too, and it just feeds on it, right? You get this thing, and it exaggerated her sort of high or in this inhibited temperament. My last child was very similar, sort of, I think, biologically built much the same way. We had 2 other kids. We didn't have a lot of time to pay attention to this child, right? We were a lot more experienced, relaxed. The baby's crying. Okay, cool. Whatever, right? And consequently, I think she's become more outgoing, less sort of responsive to things. So it really is this interactive process. But there's a real tendency, right, for parents to feed on that same thing, and so very often the environment then reinforces that biological tendency in people. So really interesting work, really, and again, it seems to have real implications for later on in life, particularly again, introversion and extraversion as a sort of basic dimension of personality. So here's a clicker question for you. Would you ever want to jump out of an airplane? A lot of people want to, if I could get to be my age, people are doing it for their 50th, 60th birthdays, whatever, they want to jump out of an airplane. Other people don't. So I want to ask you, would you ever want to jump out of an airplane, again, assuming you had a parachute? So tell me how many of you really think that's one of those things you really want to do in life. Sounds great. Other people, if you don't think you want to do that, say B. So yes, I want to jump out of an airplane. A. No, I don't want to jump out of an airplane. B. C. You're not sure. You want to halfway jump out of an airplane, or start to jump out of an airplane and crawl your way back? Okay. Anybody else? Those latecomers sticking it out of their purses? Okay. So, wow, well, so 50, well, you see a good split. So 55% of the people want to jump out of an airplane. 28% of the people, no way. I should have put hell no as one of the other ones, right? But there's one, so, yeah, that's what you get, right? People seem to differ on this kind of dimension. And it's an interesting personality character. And again, these things are sort of related to temperament, right? So there's similar concepts that, again, I think are, right around that same territory. So again, one of the most famous personality dimensions, and one of the earliest ones that people sort of identified as this introversion, extraversion idea. Particularly, historically, Hans Eysenck was one of the most famous people to study this. And again, he made that same kind of claim, right? That introverts are high in central nervous system reactivity and lower in pain tolerance. They prefer less noise when studying. How many of you like to study with the TV on or the music on? How many can only study that way? How many cannot study? How many have to have total quiet? Right? So that's the same distinction, right? It's kind of your baseline level of arousal here, reactivity, that some people need a little bit more to keep going. Some people, I can't really work unless I have total quiet very often, right? And that seems to suggest something. A similar kind of, there's a whole bunch of dimensions that are sort of related. This is one that's received a fair amount of attention by a guy named Zuckerman, the sensation-seeking dimension, that there are people who are high in sensation-seeking, a tendency to seek novelty, excitement. They have low tolerance for boredom, people that want to go out and do things and seek sensation, and other people who don't, right? Who want to kind of calm themselves down and move away. And the idea there, again, is that people are sort of chronically under-aroused. And it's been linked to neurotransmitters in the brain, this idea of sensation seeking. A really similar kind of idea that some people just seem to have kind of a low level of arousal, generally, and so they want to jack it up. They seek out situations that will make them more anxious. And other people sort of are, yeah, sure, I'm anxious and aroused enough. I want to get away from those sorts of things, right? And you see this dimension in lots of people. How many people know sensation seekers? People that seem to want to go out and, do things all the time, right? Here's a good example for me. I'll show you a nice little video of a guy I surf with, named Mike Parsons. This is one of my favorite videos. So just because I like it, there's not really any pedagogical value in this. I'm just doing it anyway because I want to show it to you. This is from this great movie. I love this. So just watch this video and see if this is something you'd want to do. Looks pretty innocuous at this point, right? No big deal. Camera pulls back. So this is actually kind of an old video, right? You've seen now these guys go out and ride these huge waves, right? Mike Parsons surfs where I surf in fair amount from San Clemente, and see him out there, most mild-mannered guy you'd ever imagine, and he does these sort of incredible things, right? He seeks out these experiences, these huge waves. I was actually out that same day here, so here's me on the next wave. I'm terrified, the same. So I feel the same way he feels riding those big waves. That's how I feel riding the little ones. But anyway, so that's this idea, right? That people seek out that kind of that sensation, and that basic idea of being under or over aroused is really a central one. And there's a lot of research to that basic distinction. Any questions about temperament or sensation seeking? So let me talk a little bit more specifically about this trait approach, right? So the temperament work came about, you know, you can fit that in, right? But that's really physiologically based in a lot of ways. And there's been a sort of a broader project to figure out, well, what are the traits that is there a set of traits that characterize people? What are the major ones? What are the important ones? You know, how do you know of all the thousands of words that people use to describe people, what are their central kind of dimensions on which people differ that really capture the important differences between people? And again, this trait approach kind of starts with this really simple descriptive kind of idea. Well, what are the dimensions on which personality differs? Not developing it from a theoretical way, but developing it empirically, so from data, right? So, again, a lot of, there's this, in the trait personality approach, there's this real emphasis on description and prediction, right? So if you ask, again, kind of a personality is, if you know, this is, Cattell was one of the famous trait theorists. His definition of personality is that which permits a prediction of what a person will do in a given situation, right? So they just want to know what you're going to do. They just want an instrument to figure out, to test you, place you on a scale, right? So they can predict what you're going to do. It's very different from the kind of the approach just to, you know, that somebody like Sigmund Freud would take, where if you ask Freud, well, how does somebody become an introvert or an extrovert, or, you know, Rogers, anybody else, they'd all give you these complicated answers about fixation of energy and, you know, this and that, positive regard. And somebody like a trait theorist would simply say, well, they're high on, why does somebody act extroverted? Well, they're high on extraversion, right? That's almost the way they approach it, right? So that, but they have to have some way of measuring extraversion. Just how do you go about this kind of thing? And you can, again, ask people to self-describe, you get other people to describe them, and you know, trait theorists have done all this kind of thing. And then what's interesting is they figure out how do you get to sort of identify what are the sort of central traits in personality, and a lot of it relies on sort of a basic statistical approach that's called factor analysis, right? And what factor analysis does is it's kind of a way to statistically distill a whole bunch of things into something smaller, to figure out sort of what are the underlying dimensions of a larger set of things. So I use this idea of distilling, right? So that's what you do when you distill liquor, kind of anything, you kind of break it down into a smaller sort of thing. And again, Cattell, who was one of the first person to approach this, and he used factor analysis and basically came up with about 16 different dimensions. And the basic idea of factor analysis is something like this. So this could be any kind of data. This could be you rating yourself. This could be other people rating you. It could be personality tests that were developed to put people on these different dimensions. So over here, we've got these, I guess what are there, 9 dimensions: shy, outgoing, calm, restless, quiet, talkative, leader, follower, assertive, unassertive, sociable, unsociable, aggressive, unaggressive, control, impulsive, and even-tempered or moody, right? So you begin with ratings of people on all 9 of these dimensions, and they would have, you know, or 9 of these characteristics, they would have many more. And then what you do with factor analysis, it tells you, you know, that there aren't really 9 different things there. There's really only 3 different things there. If you really look at it statistically, some of these things move together, right? They all, when people say that they're outgoing, they also tend to say that they're talkative. If somebody describes you as outgoing, they also tend to describe you as talkative, right? So it goes down and it basically figures out, well, what are the underlying dimensions and how many are there? And so just as an example, here you've got 9 dimensions over here, and a factor analysis would say, no, you know, really there's only 3. There's sort of these underlying, more central dimensions of introversion and extroversion that capture shy, outgoing, quiet, talkative, sociable, unsociable, dominant, submissive, leader, follower, assertive, unassertive, aggressive, unaggressive, and emotionally stable or unstable, right? So you distill down these things to these basic dimensions. You say, it looks like there's a lot of them, but there's really many fewer, right? And through this, so tons of work like this has been done since Cattell to try and sort out, using all these kinds of data, measuring different ways to measure people's personality, to see if we can come up with a sort of fundamental set, some much smaller set, to say these are the major ways that people differ. Just descriptively, really, right? And what sort of outcome of all that has been a pretty well accepted approach in psychology is that there are 5 basic dimensions on which people differ. 5 fundamental ways that people differ from one another, and they're referred to as the big 5, right? Again, generally developed through this basic approach of factor analysis and other ways to sort of figure out what are the underlying dimensions. And what the work has generated is that there seem to be these 5 different dimensions: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, right? And they're often the good way to remember them is with this acronym OCEAN, right? It's just a simple way to remember them. And again, there are traits, not types. So people are on a dimension of each of these, and everybody has a place on every dimension, right? So there's kind of 5 spots that you would occupy on this. And again, there are these 5 dimensions. Even this work has been sort of taken down. There's some people who want to claim that even dogs, for example, can be placed on these 5 basic dimensions. Other animals can. Again, so there's this sense that there's some evolutionary, some genetic, some biological, physiological basis for these kinds of things. All right? So what are these 5 dimensions like? Right, so the first one is what's, again, referred to as openness to experience. That's a typical measure. There's actually a test that you can take where you just simply describe yourself. How many people have, what's it called, ZAPs? Do you guys get those little ZAPs books or the ZAP? You can actually go in there and take the big 5 if you want to take it for yourself, and it'll give you a little score if you want to do that. And again, one of the items, I have a vivid imagination. So people who are open to experience, and people who are, it's kind of related to temper. They're comfortable with novelty. They are, they're open to new things. The way it's described often is there, these different sort of aspects of it. They tend to be high. People who are high in openness to experience tend to have a vivid imagination and fantasy life. They like art and music, and the kind of weirder the art, the better. They're receptive to their feelings. They tend to be kind of spontaneous. They try new things. They're intellectually curious and open, and tend to kind of not be stuck in, and they tend to re-examine values, kind of be, so this is the way it's always been done. Well, why do we do it that way? Let's do something different. So you got people, I don't know, and from a Zoolander, there's Hansel. I don't know if you're Zoolander. People still watch that. My kids watch this movie. It's real high on that. Steve Jobs is another good experience. The guy the sort of Apple genius, right? He was always doing these new things. He was taking drugs, and he took psychedelics, and he's always kind of searching for new things. And Apple really kind of cutting edge, as opposed to people who are much more traditional. I think Stephen Colbert's character on his TV show is kind of slow and openness to experience, right? It's like, nope, this is the way we've done it. I'm not really interested in new things. This is, that's weird. Why is that art like that? That doesn't look like anything, right? So that's this dimension of openness to experience, to being more closed to experience. Second one, conscientiousness, right, is kind of just exactly the way you would think about it, right? So some people are really conscientious. They're very diligent. They get everything done on time. They're very organized. So I get chores done right away. Other people, much more laid back, tend to let things go, don't quite, they're kind of a little more irresponsible. Charles Darwin was one of those people who was always held up as being sort of the sort of icon of conscientiousness. He was just really diligent about everything. He was very earnest. Took all these really meticulous notes, and was again kind of had that kind of uptight strategy. Roger Federer, the tennis player, is supposedly like that, very kind of meticulous about everything that he does, as opposed to other people like Lindsay Lohan or Roseanne Barr or something that don't. So again, if you're high in conscience, you tend to have your good control, self-discipline, you're organized, you're thorough, careful, direct impulse. This is a basic personality trait that people differ on, from low to conscientious to high in conscientiousness. The third one is this one, again, that you see the similarities between all these things, right? Or although they're all statistically separate enough to really be important. So extraversion. So some people like to start conversations. They go out after people. And some people, again, are kind of this more introverted personality. So a high extroversion is associated with being sociable, lively, active, assertive, sensation seeking, good examples of that. Bill Clinton, sort of the classic extrovert, everybody's all, oh yeah, shaking hands, loves to be with people. Some of these others, Robin Williams, I don't know if he's a good example or not, because I've got him up there. But it is kind of interesting. Sometimes people can be introverted when you don't expect. That's Sir Isaac Newton. Tiger Woods, sort of notoriously introverted, right? So people, we all know people like that. So this basic, whether you kind of go out and seek and get energy from people, or whether you withdraw from people. Agreeableness is kind of what you expect. Some people are kind of nice to people and tend to be, again, accommodating, empathetic, friendly, generous. They try to make people feel good and connect and see the good in things. One of the items, I have a soft heart. Anne Frank's often held up as kind of the icon of this one. I still believe, in spite of everything that happened, that people are really good at heart after, again, her going through the horror of the Holocaust. Ronald Reagan, I got Ellen DeGeneres, Tom Hanks. On the other side, you got people like Sean Penn. These people are just mean, right? It's kind of ornery, not really very friendly to people. Simon Cowell, Rush Limbaugh, right? These people who are just kind of nasty, and that's the agreeableness dimension. And finally, neuroticism is this kind of classic, do you get stressed out easily? Are you kind of worried about things all the time, or are you kind of begin more easygoing? Classic example of sort of neuroticism is Woody Allen, particularly in his kind of classic movies. He's always really worried about stuff, and so that kind of personality trait. Michael Jackson was always very anxious about everything. Probably had lots of other problems. People are more laid back. The dude from The Big Lebowski, Barack Obama, that's sort of his thing, right? Is he doesn't seem to get too worked up about anything. Paul Newman's also kind of one of those people who they kind of lay on that dimension of kind of easygoingness, right? So those are that's the big five, right? The big five dimensions on which people seem to differ. And again, you can put people on all those different dimensions, and if you basically say, I can characterize somebody on all those dimensions, so the idea is that you know a lot about that person, right? You know some important aspects of it. So let me get you to rate me. We'll see how you guys do. So if you had to rate me, my personality on the big five dimensions, which do you think is the most likely characteristic of mine? Do you think I'm A, high on openness to experience, B, high on conscientiousness, C, high on extroversion, D, high on neuroticism, E, high on life? I just put that in there for yucks. So tell me, if you just had to characterize one thing about me, which of those things would you say, based on your observations? Still chiming in here, really thinking about it. Okay. High on extraversion. That's what you guys would pick. Out of all of them, I guess second was high on openness to experience. Right, so all of you guys think I'm high on extraversion. Let me show you my actual scores on, this is based on that ZAPS thing, and you can do this. I'm not really very high on extroversion at all, right? If you look at me, I'm sort of high on I score high on conscientiousness, high on openness to experience, kind of high on agreeableness, a little kind of, emotional stability is the positive side of neuroticism. So neuroticism is all these are sort of the positive aspects, right? So it's really interesting. I do this all the time, just kind of as an illustration. You guys think I'm extrovert. I'm really naturally really introverted. I don't like to go out and be with people. I'm very comfortable in this situation when I'm talking to all of you and you're sitting there, but I really am not particularly extroverted person, which is common. People misunderstand what extroversion is, right? So a lot of times, what if you think about it in this energy way, right, extroversion is when people kind of are a little bit chronically under aroused and they like other people, make them happy, make them feel good, give them energy. And for introverts, they tend to sort of take energy away a little bit. Right, so I have to, after I've been with people a lot, I have to kind of get away and sort of settle down. I really want to get away from people. I don't feel energized. I feel like, oh, I just did all that. Now I have to relax, right? Which is a really common trait in introverts. You guys, this is a really nice demonstration of both that and really what I think it's the fundamental attribution error, right? You guys think I'm extroverted because I stand up here and talk at you all day. Right? The only experience you have with me is me standing up here and talking. So I act really extroverted. Right? But it's just that I'm put in front of a class, this is what I do, right? So it's an interesting kind of thing. You can't always tell, it isn't obvious from people's behavior, sometimes in a commonsensical way, where they would score on these dimensions. And sometimes people differ because of these states. It's more of a state thing than a trait thing. Right? So in other situations, I would appear much more introverted. But in this particular situation, I'm behaving and sort of acting introverted. But again, what this measures is these fundamental underlying dispositions that are sort of supposed to characterize people across situations and over time. Right? So that's the big five. It's really important. It was a major advance, and lots of research seems to support it. There's still people who don't buy that these are the actual five. We've really identified those five fundamental dimensions, but an awful lot of research seems to suggest that we're pretty close to that answer, right? That seems to be, at least descriptively, kind of the five major ways that people differ. Any questions about that? Trait approach. So the other sort of really good example of modern personality research is this, what's sort of referred to in a blanket way as the social cognitive approach. And it really begins with this idea that we talked about really briefly at the end of the last section of the course about this situationist critique of personality research that went on in the 1960s, in particular led by this guy named Walter Mischel. Now, Walter Mischel doesn't think that, and this is a sort of fundamental difference or schism in a sense in the personality world, he's sort of an anti-trait theorist. Right, so in his work, what he was suggesting is that if you look at the data, if you look at, and if you remember this, if you give somebody a test of some trait like honesty, and if you give it to them in different kinds of situations at different times, that there isn't good evidence that there is a fundamental trait of honesty. That whether you're honest in class, whether you cheat or not, doesn't correlate well, for example, with whether you cheat on your spouse, whether you cheat on your taxes. We have this sense that there's this kind of trait of honesty, right, that captures everything. But Walter Mischel saying no, that there isn't a good correlation. You don't see that kind of cross-situation consistency. You don't, even if you give people tests kind of over time, they don't always score the same way. So he's saying it's much more complicated than that, right? That isn't like people have these traits. And what Walter Mischel argues for is sort of this broader approach where he rejects the idea of traits for ideas like, things that have some stability though over time, like skills or competencies, cognitive styles. People have ways of thinking, things that are more responsive to situational kind of variation. So the idea of traits, if you say, yes, I give you the big five, here's how you score on all those things, and that's going to characterize your behavior all the way. We're going to really know how you're going to act in every situation that way. Walter Mischel says no. Situations have this impact, right? That people respond differently. That there is some sort of fundamental sort of consistency in people. But traits isn't a good way to talk about it, right? Because people have these different kinds of, they'll respond differently to situations, right? And, they're more responsive to conditioning, observation, so they'll learn what to do in certain situations and have kind of more specific tendencies, right? That's kind of a vague idea, right? But he's saying, really personality is more complicated than that. So let me give you an example of some of this. So let me talk about this first for a second. That again, if you characterize, like almost every debate in psychology, If you characterize it as it's either X or Y, it's either A or B, that almost never captures it, right? And what I think, so if you say, are people really like trait theorists, or are people really have traits and they always act the same way, or are they completely responsive to situations? Well, it's both of them, right? And that what it depends on a lot, or what kind of distilling down a whole bunch of ideas that people have talked about, is a lot of it depends on how powerful the situation is. Right? That powerful situations will make people act very similarly, and other situations are weaker situations, and they let personality, those are where personality characteristics will show more clearly. So again, the basic idea is that behavior is a function of an interaction of person and the situation, and that people learn through experience. Very often people will, the idea is that people, that your behavior is partly a function of what you bring to it, partly a function of the situation, right? But that there may be some amount of stability in people's personalities because they pick certain situations to behave in all the time, right? So if you're an introvert, you may stay away from situations that make you act extroverted, right? You can't always do that, so if you're in a situation like that, it might make you more extroverted, but people pick those situations, but it isn't really that they have this trait, but rather some of it is the situations that people pick to be in. And again, there's this sort of fundamental idea that some situations are kind of strong and some are weak. So again, if I let a bear go in this room, right through this door, here comes the bear, no. Everybody's going to act pretty similarly, right? Everybody's going to run like hell out the door and scream, right? It's a strong situation. As an example, some situations make everybody behave very similarly. Even here, you're all sitting here very quietly and not doing anything because this situation has lots of demands in it. But in other kinds of situations, like a party or where there aren't strong situational demands, that's where personality characteristics will show up. And so people will show sort of characteristic behaviors if they aren't in these strong situations, right? So if you're high in introversion and extroversion, in weak situations, or if you're high in introversion, right, you're gonna behave introvertedly in those situations. But if you're in strong situations where there's some other kind of demand, it will change you, right? So it's this kind of interactive idea, and it's really, it seems to capture pretty well what's going on, that there's certain situational factors involved, and there's certain sort of dispositional ones that also determine behavior. Again, a really good example of that, when personality reveals itself in weak situations in particular, right, is the work on self-regulation, and particularly Michelle's work on delay of gratification. So here's one. This is a good example that's sort of social cognitive approach, where the basic argument, right, is that people don't ever really have traits so much as they develop skills and competencies. And one key skill that people develop, some well, some not so well, is this basic idea of self-regulation. That trying to control your own behavior, controlling your own impulses, right? So that, the ideas, the intuitive ideas that people use to capture this, things like willpower. If you have a lot of willpower, self-control, can you deal with temptation? And some people are good at that. Some people are just impulsive. They kind of feel like they want to do something and they do it. And other people seem like they're better controlled. And then Walter Mischel became very interested in this idea as kind of with his notion that self-regulation, the ability to control your impulses, is a really valuable competency, a really valuable skill to develop in a person. Right, because it allows you to avoid all these sort of impulsive desires. Say, I know what I want. I'm going to kind of control myself. I'm going to kind of move forward toward a goal. Right. His take on this idea was what he called delay of gratification. Right. This simple idea that if you can delay gratification, we all know about from Freud, and there's kind of interesting connections you can see with Freud and things here. This idea that people want to gratify, they get hungry, they get thirsty, they have things they want to do, right? And if the ability to sort of delay that and say, I'm not going to do it now, I'm going to wait, and I'm going to get my gratification later, right? I'm going to keep my nose to the grindstone now, get my gratification later. That's a really powerful skill to develop, right? And he developed this nice little test to look at this in children that is usually referred to as the marshmallow test. right? So they would take a child, put them in a room with a marshmallow, right? And they would tell them, you can either have this marshmallow now, or you can refrain from eating that marshmallow, and I'll come back in a few minutes, and you can have 2 marshmallows. And it's children's ability to do that, to wait, to choose to get 2 later, more later, or a little now, right? And he found this to be a very, very powerful, interesting situation, right? That children would respond in these really interesting ways and would really differ. Let me just show you a little video that shows, this isn't from his actual studies or anything, this is just from the internet, but shows what happens when you put kids in this kind of situation. It's kind of interesting to watch their behavior. So we'll just let this play for a second.
So that's your...
Alright, here's the deal. Marshmallow for you. You can either wait, and I'll give you another one if you wait, or you can eat it now. When I come back, I'll give you another one. So you know what to do. But stay in here and stay in the chair till I come back, okay? Alright.
This kid's my favorite.
I'm gonna go do something, and then I'll come back.
It's yummy. It's really good.
It's up to you. You can have it now, or you can wait. Okay? I'll be back. Stay in the chair, okay? Okay.
Nobody's going to notice that. Anyway, you can see the real struggle these kids are under, right? I mean, they are really, they're really struggling with it. Like, they want it, right? It tastes good. It's just right there. And they're struggling, some doing it better or worse than others. So what delayed gratification, so Walter Mischel's been doing these studies for years, and it's really powerful. And again, what I want to sort of contrast it with this trait approach, because it's a little different, right? So it's like a competency that people can develop, and it depends partly on the situation, right? There are ways that will make this go better or worse for the child, right? So first of all, development. Younger children do much worse at this, right? So younger children are much more likely to eat the marshmallow now than wait for later. As children get older, even though they want that marshmallow just as much, right? Those marshmallows, they're better able to wait. So it's a skill that develops in people over time, and you can get better at it. It also, this idea about visceral proximity. So these guys have that thing right in front of them, right? So they've done, kids do much better on this if you just put a board in front, a blinder in front of them and they can't see it. Kids will do dramatically better on weighting if they just can't see the damn thing, right? And if you distract them somehow, if you give them something else to do, it's much easier to weigh. These kids they're trying to distract themselves sometimes. It's like they're doing things like, I'm not looking, right? They don't want to look at it. Or you give people, so all those are situational things, but there's also some basic trend. The kids really do differ on how well they do this, right? And it's a skill, so they it's like they develop these skills, right? So kids, some kids are able to, and this actually was started in one of his studies where he asked, the kids, how did you resist? He goes, well, I imagined it was just a fluffy white cloud, right? And so they develop these skills, and if you tell kids it's a fluffy white cloud, they'll do better. Right, so and some will self-distract, so they develop these things. What's really powerful about it is that this test, if you give this test to kids, again, it predicts, when you give it to them at the age of 4 or 5 years old, that predicts future academic and social competence at age 16. So children able to wait for 2 marshmallows at age 4 scored 210 points higher on the SAT when he actually gave this test to little kids and waited until they were 18, took the SAT. So the ability to delay gratification is an extraordinarily important basic skill, right? If you develop this skill early, then it helps you in college, it helps you in life. You can see, it's the idea of, do I want to go out drinking with my friends, or do I need to study for another 2 hours and then go out drinking with my friends, or something like that, right? It's that ability to wait that's really powerful, but it's more of a skill or a competency. So it's really interesting work. Again, another really important aspect of individual differences in personality. Any questions about that? Let me talk about one sort of last bunch of research that sort of captures this important difference in people. And this is the work that's on attributional style. So we talked about attribution, the last part of the course, this idea that people try to figure out the causes of behavior, right? And they sort of have these basic distinctions between the most important one being that your behavior is caused by something about you versus caused by something about the situation. And that idea was really influential. And it's been used to sort of look at whether there's basically individual differences in how people make attributions. Do people have different attributional styles? There's these kind of later researchers have talked about 3 different dimensions on which attributions can differ. And that people will sort of differ in how they sort of characteristically make attributions. So one again is this internal-external distinction is the behavior caused by something internal to the person or somebody else. And you can make these judgments about yourself as well. Is it stable or unstable? Is this something that about me, for example, that will persist over time, or is it unstable? And is it global or specific? Is it something that's really characteristic of me, or is it something that's not, that only shows up in this one kind of situation, or is it something that's going to show up in lots of different aspects of my life? Right, and so the idea is that people will differ on this, and they'll show either sort of an optimistic or a pessimistic attributional style. Right, particularly when they're talking about their own behavior. So if you fail a test in this class, God forbid, right? Right, the idea is, well, what judgments do you make about that? Do you make sort of a positive set of attributions? Well, I failed because of something about the situation, right? I just had too much to do, and I didn't do it. Did I fail? Is it stable? No, it's not stable. It's a bad experience. It's caused by something outside of me. It's not stable, and it's very specific to this kind of situation, right? Then you can see that's a kind of positive that puts the best spin on it, as opposed to somebody says, oh yeah, I failed this test because I'm stupid. It was all because of me. It's never going to change. It's a stable aspect of me, and it's an aspect of me all the way across my life, not just in school, but in jobs, everything. I just don't do well in things. I'm not very smart, right? So people will differ in the way they make attributions about positive and negative events. There's this sort of positive attributional style, optimistic attributional style, where you tend to, for positive events, right, you tend to see that they're internal and stable and global, but negative things that happen to you are external and unstable and specific. right? As opposed to a depressive cognitive style where you tend to see negative things as all about you, stable and global, and positive things as being, oh yeah, I just got lucky on that, right? So people will differ in the way that they show a positive or negative attributional style. We're going to talk more about this when we talk about depression, but that's kind of the thought, is that there's a basic, that may be the sort of basis of depression, or part of depression is this negative attributional style. But in general, there's been lots of work that shows that people that show this kind of optimistic attributional style and other sort of, there's other tests and measures of optimism. This is a really positive, effective trait to have in life. So people who have an optimistic attributional style, again, negative events are viewed as external, unstable, or specific versus the pessimistic one. If you look at people like that, you see that they stay healthier later in life. This is this wonderful study done by a guy named George Valiant, who actually followed a whole bunch of Harvard graduates all the way through their lives. And he was able to code from the statements that they made when they were in college. He was able to sort of look at statements they made and code them as either showing an optimistic or pessimistic attributional style, simply the way they talked about themselves, right? And then followed them over time and showed that people who had an optimistic style tended to show much, there was a strong correlation, or a significant correlation between showing an optimistic style early in life and staying healthy, right? So they lived longer, they stayed healthier in general, and it's associated with a whole bunch of other positive traits. So general optimism is associated with being happy, being productive, having satisfying social relationships, so assuming the best about the world, right? It's a really, really positive trait. I happen to be kind of a pessimistic person, maybe not show, I struggle with it sometimes, right? And I see being optimistic is really, really helpful in life, and it seems to be related to lots of really positive outcomes. But it brings up some really interesting kind of questions, right? About and particularly in the way we've thought about mental health in the past. So let me just ask you this question, one last clicker question. If optimists have a more positive outlook on life than pessimists, who do you think is closer to right? So optimists, optimists, they think the glass is half full, everything's going to turn out great, everything's great, great, great. Pessimists, the glass is half empty, everything sucks. One of those people should be closer to right. Who do you think is closer to right about the world? Do you think optimists are too optimistic? Or are pessimists too pessimistic? Who's more likely to be correct, optimists or pessimists? Is it an optimistic world or is it a pessimistic world? We're stabilized here. And the winner is, how about that? Beautiful. Perfect, right? It's probably a test of optimism and pessimism all by itself, right? So this actually has been a really central question in modern personality research. And it has to do with this phenomenon that's called the sadder but wiser effect, and the power of positive illusions. And the argument goes something like this, right? So if you have somebody if you put people in various kinds of situations, right, they will show these kind of depressive or optimistic cognitive styles. And the question is, well, again, who's right about things? Who's closer to right? So you can do it. So here's a little test that people do. They put people into a room. You interact with maybe 5 or 6 other people, and then you guys hang out together for an hour or something. Then you go back, and people rate how much the other people like them. Right? So you say, well, how much does each person in that group like you? And you find that there are people who are get sort of score high on sort of low versus high in depression. So people who score low in depression say that all those people like them a lot more than the people who are high in depression, who tend to think, oh, those people don't like me. But we know how much all those people actually like you. And if you look at that, what you find is that the depressed people are more likely to be correct. So what you find is that people who are sort of normal, non-depressed people think people like them more than they really do. Hate to tell you that, but that's what you find, right? And you found that in a couple different situations. There's another classic situation where they put people into sort of the task that they gave them was you have to move these knobs and certain things will happen on a screen, lights will flash. You got to figure out how much control you have. Right, so you're turning knobs and the lights are flashing and it's complicated. You're trying to figure out, whether you're controlling them or whether it's going randomly. And again, depressed people say, oh, I didn't have any control. Those things were going off in various ways. Non-depressed people tend to think that they had more control. If you look at it, and they would do the situation where they actually varied how much control people had. Either what they were doing had 100% determined what lights flashed, or it had 50%, or it had no. And pessimists, people who were depressed, were almost always right on the money. They were closer to being right about how much control they really had. And regular non-depressed people tended to overestimate how much control that they had. So a bunch of data like this brought up this kind of interesting idea of depressive realism, that depressed people have a more accurate perception of how they're viewed by others and actual control over outcomes. And Shelley Taylor, who's a very, very famous social psychologist, spent most of her career at UCLA, sort of thought about all this stuff and made this argument about the power of positive illusions, right? That this is a real phenomenon, that seeing the world the way it is, with all of its flaws, right, is not the best way to be happy, right? If you realize that an airplane could just come right through this thing right now and kill us all, or any terrible things that happen, right? If you really thought about how random the world is, according to Shelley Taylor, you'd basically be under your bed in the fetal position, right? That's no way to go through life, son, right? That's not a way to go through life. And so she makes the argument that mental health is characterized by positive illusions, that people who are mentally healthy tend to show these positive illusions. And those positive illusions, seeing the world as a place that is more positive than it is, that you can control more than it is, that actually is indicative of and promotes mental health. It allows you to be more productive, you're more persistent, you think, oh gee, things are going to go well, and people like me. So you're more likely to approach them, more likely to be nice to them, more understanding, and promote social relationships, right? So this idea that mental health isn't about seeing the world the way it is. Mental health is about seeing the world better than it is, right? That's a real interesting departure, and contrast that to the work of the sort of dominant view of mental health represented by somebody like Carl Rogers, right? So what Carl Rogers is saying, no, mental health is when you see that you're not everything you can be. You know that you're not your ideal self, right? And you know all your weaknesses. Right? So that's been this idea about being in touch with yourself, being in touch with your failings and things. That's been the sort of dominant view of mental health. That's what we want you to do. Shelley Taylor's view really is a different view entirely. He says, no, that's not what you want to do. That makes you depressed. We have these natural sort of positive illusions that we show, and normal non-depressed people tend to see the world in a way that's kind of characterized by these positive illusions, seeing yourself as better than average and having more control and all that stuff. So it's a really interesting connection about whether, to what extent sort of, being in touch with reality and seeing the world for all the blemishes that it has is really like a hallmark of mental health or an impediment to mental health. Right? A really interesting sort of body of research that emerged, again, from research rather than from sort of clinical experience. Any questions about it? We had a question over here. Speak up real loud. Comment, good. So guys, you gotta give me 3 more minutes. Really good. So that's really, so part of what you're saying is the actual phenomenon right? So even
People try to actually be, like actors have their, you know, to see if.
so that, yes, I don't. So it's first of all, we're going to get more into this when we talk about depression in the next part of the class. So there's sort of this chicken and egg part is part of the phenomenon. Is it that having this attributional style makes you depressed, or does depression lead you to have this kind of attributional style? So you're depressed, and you start not being good with people, and they start to not like you, and all this. So that's part of the phenomenon, right? Is that it does go both ways, and people are concerned about whether attributional style is a symptom of depression or a cause of depression. That's part of it. But it's also the case that, again, if you look, it is the case that non-depressed people, other people like them better. They very often, maybe do exert control better. But if you look at how much control somebody has in an actual situation, it's still the case that non-depressed people are the ones that are more likely to be wrong. They tend to they're not the ones that are seeing the world as it is. They're seeing the world better than it is. Right? And depressed people, may see the world a little worse than it is, but they're closer. If you looked at who's closer to reality, and you can only do that in these kinds of experiments where you set up these situations, right? You get this. Now, it's a very controversial phenomenon, and not everybody agrees with this, but there's a fair amount of data to demonstrate. You see the logic of it, right? If you're sort of more optimistic, more sort of expecting good things to happen, it has kind of a self-fulfilling quality to it, right? That it can promote positive things in your life. And so even if it begins as an illusion, it becomes less of an illusion because you sort of realize it. So again, really interesting idea. A lot of research on this topic, and a lot of research still to do. Any other questions? Have a great weekend. The study guide will be up on the webpage soon. Tuesday, we're going to talk about the nature of mental health. We'll see you then. Have a good weekend.